Imagine a world where political prisons no longer exist. Abusive regimes no longer need frozen gulags, re-education through labor just a far-off memory. But tyranny is not gone. It's pervasive, everywhere. Mass surveillance keeps tabs from roadside cameras to online trackers to the phone in your pocket. You hesitate to say what you think, even if it's true. You weigh your actions based on social trends. Stepping out of line could end your life, but not in the physical sense. It's a death that's more encompassing, a prison that's everywhere, and that can be flipped on in an instant. What you risk is that the system itself, society as we know it, will just lock you out. You can't work because you can't get paid. You can't rent a home because you can't digitize the payments. You can't buy food because cash is not accepted and you don't have a bank account. Now, you might say you don't believe in sci-fi dystopias like this, but you'd better start believing, because this reality is already here. What I'm talking about is the issue of debanking, and especially the issue of banks canceling accounts for political reasons tied in with emerging technologies for AI mass surveillance, good or bad citizen ratings, and centralized bank digital currencies, CBDCs. In China, this system is already a reality. You might have heard of the social credit system. Every person has a citizen score, good or bad. The Chinese Communist Party is a file on everybody. Everything you do, everything you buy, everything you say is tracked, recorded, and scored. Now, if you have a good score, you enjoy benefits that would be the norm in most free countries. If you get a bad score, you start to lose access step by step. Eventually, you lose access to the transportation system. Eventually, the walls close in even more. And finally, you'll have trouble even renting an apartment. And you're not only just scored on your own actions. The scores can be lowered by your friends or family to incentivize people to even suppress each other. Okay, so you might think this sounds like unhappy, far-off things, right? Only in China. Well, not quite. We actually have most of these systems in place, even right here in the United States. Most of the key parts for it anyway. It's just that it's not currently being enforced by government. It's being enforced by businesses and banks. You see, there's a policy that's held by banks and payment processors. It's tied to what they call reputational risk. Basically, if something you do could be deemed a risk to the reputation of the bank or payment processor, they can debank you, canceled. In February, JP Morgan, they admitted they closed the personal and business bank accounts of President Donald Trump after the incidents on January 6, 2021. The admission only came out after Trump sued the bank and its CEO for $5 billion. In another case, Dr. Joseph Mercola was debanked by JP Morgan Chase in 2023. The bank never fully explained why. It cited unexpected activity as the reason, but didn't give many details. The suspicion of Dr. Mercola and his supporters, however, was that it was tied to his public comments against the COVID-19 vaccines. Some of this even targeted religious institutions. This included, just as examples, the debanking of the National Committee for Religious Freedom, the pro-life Arkansas Family Council, the Christian charity group Defense of Liberty, and Indigenous Advanced Ministries. The Foundation for Government Accountability said in a report that debanking is political and religious discrimination that seeks to pressure or silence those with whom they disagree. Some cases of debanking weren't even doing anything illegal. It was all about social politics. Back in December 2025, it was revealed that top banks, these included JP Morgan Chase and Bank of America, debanked businesses tied in with industries because they did not fit in with the political climate. A release in the Office of the Comptroller of Currency said that between 2020 and 2023, 9 banks made inappropriate distinctions, quote unquote, against lawful businesses because they allegedly went against the values of the banks. The review says this, quote, sectors subjected to restricted access included oil and gas exploration, coal mining, firearms, private prisons, tobacco and e-cigarette manufacturers, adult entertainment, and digital assets. Now look, like those businesses or not, they're not doing anything illegal, at least not these ones. Basically, if you didn't line up with things like the anti-gun push, or if you were an industry that didn't fit in with the climate narrative, you risked getting financially canceled. And it doesn't end there. PayPal, Venmo, Zelle, digital payment processors, they, as we speak, have restrictions on guns. Basically, they can suspend your account if you send or receive payments related to guns. PayPal even has a policy that if you use their service to buy guns, ammunition, certain gun accessories, or even some types of knives, they can ban your account or even penalize you by taking money out of your account. And the list goes on. The issue of debanking, it's actually even worse outside the United States, from the truckers who were debanked for protesting lockdowns in Canada to people speaking against social policies in Europe. But here's where it gets really important. These forms of debanking, they're happening under what looks like just normal business policy. Businesses operate under different standards than government institutions, but it's not really that black and white. There's actually a lot of political overlap on policy, and it turns out most cases of debanking actually were political. A January 2026 report from Cato had a shocking conclusion on what's really going on behind debanking. It said this, quote, "While media and political narratives often attribute these closures to political or religious discrimination, the study finds that the majority of debanking cases stem from governmental pressure." Basically, it says that in some cases, governments have been directly instructing financial institutions to close down people's accounts. But there's another form it takes, an indirect approach that it says, quote, "involves the use of laws and regulations to make it increasingly more difficult to serve customers. In some cases," the report says, "the government makes it economically infeasible to serve customers by increasing regulatory costs. They use this to squeeze the industries." Now, on the side of banks, this goes back to what I mentioned earlier, the vague and very broad policy on reputational risk. Basically, banks can declare that providing services to a person or business damages their public reputation, their brand value, their image, their stakeholder trust. So if a person gets wrapped up in a scandal, if they get branded as being controversial, or maybe just they have a policy the banks don't like, well, they can cancel their accounts. The banks can go after them. They may have broken no laws, but for example, if a news outlet runs a hit piece on them, protesters take to the streets, and there's a public incident, the banks can then decide to enact this policy of what they call de-risking and cancel the person's account. And they can typically do this because of their terms of service. A little line in there that says they can cancel accounts at any time and for any reason. But as mentioned, there's also a political dimension to this, and this actually goes back to the Obama administration. Back in 2013, the Department of Justice launched Operation Choke Point, and that was to investigate banks for the dealings of companies they gave services to. That operation, it ended up targeting a huge swath of businesses, some more controversial and some less controversial. It included things like online payday lenders. It included some bad things like Ponzi schemes. It included also other questionable services. But it also targeted a lot of legitimate businesses. The firearms industry was one of the big targets. Washington Times wrote in 2014, quote, "Gun retailers say the Obama administration is trying to put them out of business with regulations and investigations that bypass Congress and choke off their lines of credit, freeze their assets, and prohibit online sales." An investigation from the House Oversight Committee noted the Obama administration program aimed to, quote, "choke out companies the administration considered high risk or otherwise objectionable, despite the fact they were legal businesses." The goal of the initiative is to deny these merchants access to the banking and payment networks that every business needs to survive, quote unquote. And the effect of this, the congressional report says, was that it, quote, "forced banks to terminate relationships with a wide variety of entirely lawful and legitimate merchants." And notably, this was done under the same legal language as the more recent cases of debanking. The policy that providing banking services to some companies creates a reputational risk sufficient to trigger a federal investigation. And here's the important part. This started because federal investigations were being launched against lawful businesses. Many were politically labeled as being high risk, despite not doing anything wrong. So if the banks didn't want to suffer a reputational risk, they had to debank whoever was targeted through that political campaign. So in other words, they set up a system where certain industries were labeled as controversial under the government policy, then threatened to investigate the banks, which then acted as the pressure for the banks to cancel the services of those companies. Whole industries were hit like this. Entire swaths of the economy became dangerous to work in because political pressure became a political tool. And look, those policies were mostly closed up for a bit, but they made a hard comeback when Joe Biden took office. That was the age of COVID-19, January 6th, and the targeting of so-called MAGA extremists. In 2024, E.J. Antoni of the Heritage Foundation said, quote, "Government documents unsealed at the end of 2020 proved that the federal government used its regulatory authority over financial markets to attack political opponents." The report even notes how some organizations work to label people under things like so-called hate maps, which banks then use as the dog whistles for debanking. And the problem is still there, but there are some initiatives looking to kind of unravel it. In August 2025, for example, Trump issued an executive order to stop the practice, and others tied to it, including, for example, government-directed surveillance on that front. It notes this, quote, "As a result, individuals, their businesses, and their families have been subjected to debanking on the basis of their political affiliations, religious beliefs, or lawful business activities, and have suffered frozen payrolls, debt, and crushing interest, and other significant harms to their livelihoods, reputations, and financial well-being." And so based on this, the order then declares that debanking could amount to discrimination. And because of that, it could be illegal under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. And so based on this, the presidential order has demanded that banks remove their policies on reputational risk that leads to debanking. Now, has that happened? Is this all shut down? Well, sort of. There are still cases. And there's also the looming possibility that the next administration, they could just bring these policies back in some form. But even internationally, there are other looming challenges with debanking, which are also affecting Americans. The European Union, for example, they have the Digital Services Act, and that also comes with government-directed policies to identify and manage what they define as illegal and harmful content online. Targets for that include everything from social media to video games. And when the talk about illegal or harmful content comes into play, they're not talking about that under American law. This is defined under European law. So while that includes content, deemed actually harmful to children, it also extends to things like alleged hate speech and what they call harassment. And even further than that, the Chinese Communist Party has been pushing its totalitarian policies of digital currencies tied to state-owned banks, which means mass tracking of all purchases, tied in with an all-encompassing social control program under the social credit system. The CCP is trying to make that a global policy for governance. They're even exporting it to other countries as we speak, even in parts of Asia and in Latin America. And it all really comes down to what gets deemed controversial and who decides that label. If a regime wants to outlaw guns one day, well, criminalize speech or even ban certain religions, all they need to do is establish a form of cancel culture to punish whatever or whoever the target is. Under communist regimes like the CCP, they do it directly. The regime dictates a target and people risk having their lives destroyed if they do otherwise. But in the free world, well, look, we have things like elected government and constitutions that actually get practiced. But that's also the problem with debanking. You see, debanking functions as a type of workaround. It's an extrajudicial system. You don't have to do anything illegal to get your life destroyed. Someone can just dictate that a word is offensive or a business is controversial. Maybe it's engaging in politics that someone doesn't like. The laws still protect you technically. The government can't censor you, but they can pressure private industries to punish you for them. And this is exactly what's been happening with debanking. And if we look further down the road, well, look, what's in the pipeline? There's now a global push for CBDCs, centralized bank digital currencies. In other words, no more cash, everything is digital. And then what happens if retailers go all digital, no more cash payments? And if the bank is the one that runs all the digital payments, what happens if you get canceled? What happens if they say a certain product violates our terms and we're not going to let you buy it? If they control the currency, they control that as well. But what do you think? Should private businesses be able to choose who they provide services to or who they don't? Can they be forced to engage in an industry that goes against their values? Should banks be held to a different standard than that? What do you think the solution should be? Let me know in the chat and join me again next week on The Josh Phillips Show.